So this morning we're going to have two panelists. In the second part of the hour, you're going to hear from Brent Fulton. And Brent is the founder and president of ChinaSource. You can see some more details on your screen about Brent. I've appreciated knowing him for a couple years now. And he's lived in Hong Kong for, I think, about 11 years. Right now, he's based primarily in California. And he's been married 26 years to Jasmine. And I've had an opportunity to meet her as well, which is a great pleasure. He's the author of a bunch of books, as you'll see there as well, and I'm sure we'll get some insights from those books. And our first presenter is going to be Joanne Pittman. And Joanne is, she's also at ChinaSource. And I appreciated Joanne sharing about her experience in China. She worked in 3 different cities across 28 years. And she also has authored some different books. So with that, I want to give up control of my screen, and I'm going to let Joanne take over and share with us some principles about partnering in China. Joanne.
Okay, it's nice to see all of you. Greetings from cold and blustery and snowy Minnesota, but we're beginning our first of about 5 months of winter here. So it's nice to be a part of this, and I am grateful for the folks at Vision Synergy for the opportunity to be a part of this. In my section of the presentation this morning, I want to talk about partnering in China, some cultural considerations, and just thinking about when we do partnerships, of course, we're doing it in a particular cultural context. So before we look at the material that I've got ready this morning, I just want to present these poll questions very quickly. Which statement best describes your attitude towards culture? Since we are all created in the image of God, differences are minimal. Once I learn the language and culture, once I learn the local languages, the culture's differences will no longer be a problem, or understanding the local worldview is important and takes a lot of time and effort. And so I'll just give you a few seconds to answer those questions very quickly. So you can go ahead and answer those right now.
Yeah, and Joanne, this is Ben again. Just to reassure everybody, your results are anonymous. So we would invite you all to jump in and vote. The results are anonymous.
Okay, so the poll results. So we've got, it looks like everybody believes that cultural learning is important. That's good. So we're going to move on now. And what I want to do today is to talk about some cultural considerations for China. And I just want to, again, by way of introduction, to just talk about why culture matters. And I think that the thing that we need to remember is that partnerships take place within a particular cultural context, and therefore success in partnerships involves learning the culture and seeing the worldview of the local worldview as valid, and then being willing to submit and participate in the local culture. So what I want to do is talk about 5 what I like to call key cultural rules of China, that in my experience are places where, in many cases, where Westerners working in China, where we tend to have culture clashes at these different points. And I want to highlight 5 of them, what I call key cultural rules. And I like the term rules because in many ways, if you know the rules, you kind of know what you're supposed to do. And so the first one I want to talk about is social relationships. The Chinese word is guanxi, and for those of you who've been involved with China, you've interacted with China, you're familiar with this term. But the Chinese word guanxi really means relationships, and it's the core of everything that is done in China. In that everything runs on relationship, and China's just this giant network of relationships. And when we are going to China and we're seeking to establish partnerships with local believers and churches or ministries, we need to be aware of this. Relationships are nurtured through personal care and respect. there's a lot of time that has to be spent in China with getting to know people and building trust. And the way you build trust in China is through social relationships. You're not going to be trusted automatically. In some ways, it's the opposite of at least American culture, where when we meet somebody new, we trust somebody until and unless they give us a reason not to. China's the opposite. They're not going to trust somebody until and unless a reason is given to trust that person. So we need to spend time building and maintaining these relationships. Relationships are more important than written agreements. And again, for those of us who come from Western cultures, this can be very difficult because we're so wired to get the agreement, get it on paper, that's the law, everything is going to run according to that. But what happens in China is that the agreements flow out of the relationships, and they're maybe sometimes just required legally, but everything happens through the relationship. And I just want to give an example. I got an email recently from somebody who wrote and said, "Oh, I want to go to China," and he named a city and serve there. And do you know of any churches in this particular city that I could contact about becoming about partnering with? As far as I could tell, he had never been to China. And I wrote back and I said, well, you've got the Three Self in the House Church, but I said, you can't just walk in and say, "Hi, will you be my partner?" And so my advice to him was, go to the city, learn the language, sit in the churches, build relationships, and maybe 5 or 6 years later you can establish some sort of partnership. But it was illustrative to me that of the American, I have this project, I want to go, I'll find a partner and do it. And it actually takes time. Nurturing these relationships takes a lot of time. The second thing that I want to talk about is the concept of face. Now, we hear a lot of talk right now. It's really popular to talk about the concept of honor and shame. And, many cultures in the world, particularly in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, are honor and shame cultures. And really, this concept of honor and shame is just another way of saying face is important, because face is your reputation or dignity in front of the group. How are you perceived by the members of your relational network? And losing face is doing something or having something done to you that brings shame. And saving face or giving face is is another way of saying honor. And so I think it's important to remember here is that when we're involved in partnerships in China, we're never really dealing with simply an individual. We may think, oh, this is the liaison that I'm working with, and he and I have a good relationship and everything is fine. But it's important to remember that when you're dealing with an individual, you are also indirectly dealing with that individual's group, his relationship network. And things that you say and do can affect his face in front of the group. And so we need to be careful that we're not doing things and saying things that would bring dishonor to that person or cause that person to lose face, and we're saying and doing things that would give honor or face to them. Just for example, some things that we might do that would cause a person to lose face, the person that we're dealing with, would be to speak too directly. In Chinese culture, a very direct no can be perceived as a loss of face or causing somebody to lose face. So they say, "Can you help me do this?" And you say, "Well, no, I can't do that." That direct no can be considered, it causes that person to lose face. So preserving face, saving face, giving face is all part of the Chinese indirect communication that we also experience. So it's one of those difficult things because we have face in this country, we just don't talk about it. But in China, it really is sort of it underlies everything. And of course, I had a professor once tell me, he was explaining this to me because I said, it's really hard to understand. He says, "Well, we don't understand it either." But he said, "The problem is we can't talk about it, because if we talk about how important face is in Chinese culture, then we lose face. So we don't really talk about it either." So But it is important, and I think the important thing is, remember, you're never just dealing with an individual. You're dealing with an individual and his network of relationships, and you have to keep that in mind in your conversations and your dealings with them. Another key cultural rule that that I found, and by the way, these are based on my years of experience in China, and these are the areas where I experienced, especially working with Westerners, mostly Americans, where the cultures tended to clash the most. So this is why I'm highlighting these particular ones. So the third one is called, I call the insider and outsider mentality. Chinese culture is an insider and outsider culture. And I remember learning this a number of years ago, and I stumbled across a Chinese phrase called 内外有别, which literally means insiders and outsiders are different. And so I asked my tutor at that time, I said, well, help me, understand how this plays out in everyday life. And she said, well, when we go to the park, and you have to pay 5 kwai for your ticket, which would be like $5 for your ticket, and I only have to pay 50 cents for my ticket, that's 内外有别. And I was like, oh, I thought they were just cheating me. And her response was, no, you are an outsider. What makes you think that you should have the same benefits as me, a Chinese? And my response was, because that's the way I was brought up, that everybody's equal, everybody should have equal treatment. And she said that's not the case here. And so it was a real kind of eye-opening experience for me to realize that, oh, I wasn't just I still felt like I was being cheated, but that's not necessarily how they were approaching it. So in Chinese culture, there are 2 kinds of people in the world. Really, the world, all humanity is divided into two categories. And the first category is Chinese people, and then there are non-Chinese people, or the foreigners. And so those of you who've been to China, you're called 外国人, which means foreigner. Maybe you're walking down the street and little children laugh at you and say, oh, look at the foreigner, look at the foreigner. That's just the way they view the world, that there are Chinese people and there are non-Chinese people. And like Jew and Gentile, if you're one, you can't be the other. It's mutually exclusive. It's mutually exclusive categories. So this is an important thing to remember, because obviously those of us who are not Chinese, we are going to China. We're seeking to build relationships and partner with China. We are always going to be outsiders. And it's very, very important to remember that. I know many people that I've worked with over the years in China, they've come, oh, I just want to live here and become like a Chinese person and be accepted as a Chinese. And I'm just like, you know what? It's never going to happen. You're always going to be an outsider. So actually, I like the term that I learned from Don Larson. He was a linguist back in the 70s and 80s, and he talked about the concept of being an acceptable outsider. We're going to be outsiders, but how do we be acceptable outsiders? Outsiders that are, accepted, but people want to actually deal with us, and we're not walking around making too many blunders. So as outsiders in an insider-outsider culture, we're going to experience things that probably will make us uncomfortable. Some of them will be positive, some of them will be negative. Is when you go as an outsider into Chinese culture, you're treated as a guest. So some, outsiders as guests. And if you've been to China, you know what this is like. There's a lot of, oh, sit here, eat this. You get this honorific treatment, and you're treated like royalty. Well, that's rooted in this insider-outsider culture, but also you're an outsider who's a guest. And Chinese culture has a very refined sense of hospitality, and so you're treated that way. It also means that you have limited access to the culture. There's simply a lot of things as an outsider that we will never know, that we will never understand. And in many cases, the Chinese like it that way. and I've had many discussions with Chinese friends trying to figure things out, and they're just like, "Oh, you're a foreigner. You can never understand that." And I think we just have to at some point come to accept that there's a lot going on in the culture that we don't know and understand. But my experience is, though, that Chinese really love to see foreigners try to learn their culture, their language, and adapt as much as possible. And there is an expectation of adapting to local ways and customs, the banquets and different things like that. But it's important to remember at the same time that you can never actually become an insider in Chinese culture. But think about this concept, though. How do you become an acceptable outsider? And we could do a whole other seminar on that. The fourth cultural rule that I want to talk about is social hierarchy. And we started this part of the presentation off by talking about relationships. And PowerPoint is forcing me to sort of put these into a linear list. So this and this and this. But actually, all of these things are how relationships are done. And all of these things are what support and keep and grease and keep the machine of relationships going. So the fourth one is social hierarchy. And I always think this one is a little bit ironic because supposedly under communism, Chairman Mao and the Communist Party, they wanted to construct a classless society where everybody was the same. And I think we remember images from the early days of the People's Republic of everybody looking alike, wearing the blue suits. It was all this, we're all the same. But that was just a veneer, and it just lasted for a short time. Because in traditional Chinese culture, and this still plays out in modern Chinese culture too, relationships are ordered by status. Your status is very important. It's not quite to the level of Japan where you have the bowing and you have a different language for, you use this type of language if you're talking to this type of person. But hierarchy is still very important in Chinese culture. And so when you're in China, business cards are quite important, although with the advent of WeChat, I've noticed they're diminishing somewhat. But many times you're given a business card in China and it lists, I'm the dean of this and this, with 5 different titles. Well, listing those 5 titles is important because then that is sort of declaring what your status is. And if my business title only has 1, maybe I'm not quite as high, or depending on, but you can see what the titles are. So when trying to establish partnerships in China, again, it's important to know who you're dealing with. And this can be tricky in China because the person that you're interacting with, the person that you're building a relationship with, and things are going smoothly, they might not be a person who has any decision-making authority. And so it's important to know who you're dealing with and where they are in the pecking order. Because I just know of so many instances where people went to China and they were either in a business or education or ministry environment, and everything was going smoothly, had this great relationship, but it turned out that the person they were dealing with really didn't have any authority to do anything. And so it's a lot of figuring out, it's really, in many cases, reading the tea leaves. But who are the people that you need to be talking to? My experience is that if you have if there's a person locally who you trust and have a good relationship with, and maybe even hire, who can help navigate this, it's very important. When I was in China, I was in the educational field, and I would travel around and visit with university officials. And I had an administrative assistant who was Chinese, and we would go into these meetings, and she could figure out in just a couple of minutes who was who and where they were on the pecking order. And she would let, you need to talk to that person. Don't worry about listening to what that person says, because they're the lowest on the totem pole. And it was extremely helpful to me because there was no way I would have been able to figure it out. So if you can find some local person who can really help you navigate and interpret what's going on in this sphere, I think that would be very, very helpful. I know it was for me. The last one that I want to talk about is the concept of ritual. And again, this can trip Westerners up, particularly Americans, but I would think Europeans as well, because we don't have a lot of ritual in our society today. In fact, I would say in American culture anyway, ritual is kind of devalued, and we would, if we label something as ritual, that kind of is a negative. Oh, I don't like to do that. That's just it doesn't have any meaning. It's just a ritual. But in China, it's very different. Ritual still is very, very important because participating in a ritual is a way of saying, I know what I'm supposed to do here. I know what the rules are, and I'm willing to play them and to enter in and to be a part of them. And again, like I said, this can be very difficult for Westerners because it seems inefficient, it seems superficial, it doesn't seem sincere. But in China, it's something that has to be done. It's where the relationships are built. And many of the rituals that those of us in a ministry context, many of the rituals that we will be a part of will center around eating and drinking. Maybe not drinking alcohol. Maybe in some contexts that might be permissible as well. But you'll be dined. You'll go to the banquet. If you've been to China, you've had that banquet or that formal meal, and there's rituals down to where you sit and who toasts when and what's the order of the dishes and who starts it and who ends it and all of that. And it's very, very important, even though it seems, and I'm speaking, to me, it seems tedious. It's something that has to happen. And so even though it's hard, I would just really encourage you to sort of try to learn what the rituals are in the context that you're working, and sort of not just be willing to participate, but embrace them. Embrace them as much as you can, because the rituals are very, very important. The Chinese sort of have a way of in my opinion, a way of thinking that says, this is the way the ancestors have done it, and it's good enough for us, so we're going to keep doing it. And so be prepared for what we may seem to think is sort of tedious and meaningless rituals. But again, go back to the beginning. Your goal is establishing and building relationships. And particularly when it comes to the rituals of eating and drinking and things like that, that really is where the relationship building begins. Chinese build relationships over food, over meals. And so again, what I would just say in conclusion is that, culture matters. And as I said before, we want to establish partnerships, but we're doing it in a particular cultural context. And we need to know what those are and be willing to participate and enter into those.
Well, thank you so much, Joanne. That gives us, I'm sure, a bunch of questions in my mind. And as you have been listening, we've got about 17 folks around the world right now. Feel free to put your question to Joanne by using that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll ask those at the end. Joanne, I'll invite you to give up control of your screen, and we're going to hear from Brent Fulton. And as I mentioned at the outset, Brent heads up China Source and has experience living inside China, but is currently based in California. And so, Brent, we're going to give you the balance of the time. And again, folks, as you hear things that jump out or quotes, interesting insights, feel free to share those with the rest of us. We can learn from each other and use the chat button for that. Brent?
Thank you, Ben. We're going to be looking now at how partnerships look from within China, looking at how believers in China look at partnering with Christians from outside China, and also looking at how the government looks at foreigners being involved in working in China. Before we jump into that, we have a poll question here.
Yeah, Daniel, I'll bring this up on your screen, and Brent, maybe you can just talk us through those choices.
So we've got the, from your experience, what constitutes the biggest challenge to partnering with Christians in China? From your experience, is it the cross-cultural and relationship issues? Is it inappropriate overseas influence, leadership management issues, religious restrictions, or doctrinal and theological issues? So please take a minute and respond from your own experience of partnering in China. What do you feel is the biggest challenge? And we'll see those results coming up. The majority of you said cross-cultural and relationship issues, followed by religious restrictions. As you'll see shortly, as we asked Chinese Christians, what did they feel were the biggest challenges to partnering? They also identified cultural issues as the biggest challenge. So let's dive in and look at that. The data we're going to be looking at in the next few slides comes from a survey of Christian leaders in China that was taken at the end of 2015. 1,200 Christian leaders in China were asked about a number of things, including their perception of working with foreigners, foreign Christians in ministry. And they talked, first of all, about the benefits of partnering. From their perspective, the largest benefit was equipping. And this is not surprising. From the late 1950s all the way up to the 1980s, there were no new Christian leaders trained in China. Yet during that time, the church in China grew exponentially. And so theological and biblical training have been a mainstay of ministry in China in the last 30 years. And believers in China have certainly recognized that. Another less tangible benefit that believers in China have perceived has been a broadened perspective. Being able to understand the church outside of China, which for many of them has been kind of a mystery. Being able to think differently about the future and how to anticipate the future and how to do planning in ministry. And then also being able to understand more about missions and unreached people groups as the church in China has developed a burden for missions overseas. There is a lot of zeal to do cross-cultural ministry, but not a lot of believers in China have actual experience in doing cross-cultural mission. And so a broadened perspective in terms of what does mission look like has been very helpful to believers in China. Some of the challenges that Christians in China have perceived: cultural differences, not surprisingly, come up. And a couple things here that we could mention. One is the sense that the believers that come over to try to be helpful to the church in China just often do not understand the local context in which they're trying to work. And so that's why understanding the kind of things that Joanne talked about earlier is so important, to really understand the Chinese context. And the perception is oftentimes the foreigners coming over don't really understand the local context very well. Westerners in particular who come to China want to bring solutions to problems, but oftentimes the solutions that they bring in terms of ministry don't fit the local context. And also, Westerners can tend to be very systematic in their thinking. So we want to bring systems that are going to be helpful for ministry. But oftentimes these tend to be very theoretical, but not real practical from the standpoint of believers in China. Another challenge that Christians in China have pointed out in partnering is insufficient communication. Oftentimes the communication with the foreign partner tends to be rushed. It can tend to be very sporadic, particularly if the foreign group they're working with is not resident in China and somebody just comes in for a short period of time and has to get a lot of communication taken care of and then is out of reach for a while. It's very difficult to have good communication. If the communication is done through an interpreter, of course, a lot can be lost in translation. And oftentimes the communication assumes that if they've heard what I've said, then they must have understood it. But as partners with the church in China, we can't assume that just because we've been heard, we've actually been understood, much less actually agreed with. And so oftentimes a foreign partner will go to China, will talk through a ministry project and assume that, oh yeah, they get it. They understand what we're doing here. But actually maybe the Chinese partner has been very polite to listen, but has not really taken on board everything that the foreign partner was trying to get across. And so the importance for communication just cannot be stressed too much. And then a third challenge that Chinese believers have pointed out is inappropriate foreign influence. Unfortunately, when money is introduced into a partnership, the assumption is often that the money also entails a degree of control and the expectation of control. And for Chinese believers, this has been very problematic. Foreign partners have also gotten involved in the local Chinese leadership situation in ways that are not appropriate. In some cases, coming in and elevating a Chinese partner to a position of leadership, but the others in the group didn't really agree to that or didn't think that that was appropriate. And as Joanne mentioned earlier, the order of relationships in China is so important, and oftentimes the foreign partner comes in and doesn't understand the existing order of relationships and can really mess up that order and cause everybody in the group to be very uncomfortable. Also, the introduction of money and foreign resources brings in the whole problem of dependency. And one of the frustrations of Chinese believers is that over time, as the foreign money goes away or as the foreign leadership has to leave, then the ministry itself is not sustainable because that foreign contribution is no longer there. And so in partnering with believers in China, we really need to be aware of this problem of exerting an inappropriate level of influence. In this survey that was taken of believers in China, we asked, what do they perceive as the needs of for partnering with the church outside of China? Where are the areas in which they think that the church outside China could be most helpful to them? And I'd like to mention a few of those here. One is the whole area of mentoring. And if you look at this chart here, you see that the blue bar represents the importance of this particular contribution to the church in China in the past. The orange bar represents how important it is currently perceived, and the gray bar represents how important they believe it will be in the future. And so if we look at these two areas here of training and mentoring, we see, of course, that training has been perceived as a very important way in which the overseas church can partner with the church in China and continues to be very important. But in the future, the importance of training for the church in China will be diminishing somewhat. Then we look at mentoring and we see that mentoring is continually becoming more important as a contribution by the outside church to the church in China. As more and more training resources have been made available in China, And as more Chinese Christians have gotten advanced theological training, in many ways they are able to meet their own training needs by themselves, or they have a lot more opportunities to get the training they need, whether within country, getting it online, going overseas for seminary training, etc. And so there are more opportunities to receive training. But in the course of doing training for believers in China, what has emerged is that oftentimes the deep issues of leaders in China, the heart issues, are not being addressed through the formal classroom training that they're receiving. And so there needs to be a going deeper into the heart issues of these leaders. And that going deeper is accomplished through mentoring. And so Chinese Christian leaders increasingly are recognizing that they're hitting a wall in their leadership, in their relationships, in their family relationships, and they need somebody to come alongside with them and walk with them as they approach those hurdles and deal with those obstacles that are coming up. Another reason why mentoring is increasingly an important and valued contribution to the church in China is that believers in China are embarking on new kinds of ministry. As the opportunities have opened up in China, they're getting involved in publishing, youth work, counseling, working with the homeless, many different new avenues of outreach. But they've never done these things before. And so there's an opportunity for folks who may have had experience in those kinds of ministry to come alongside the believers in China, not to tell them what to do, but to be there as a sounding board, as an encouragement, as the Christians in China embark on these new areas. And so mentoring allows that to happen. A second identified need among believers in China is building mission platforms. As I mentioned earlier, the church in China has a increasing zeal to be involved in cross-cultural missions, but so far very little actual experience in doing that. And so we see from this graph here that there is an expectation that the church in China would be receiving more help from the outside in the whole area of mission platforms. And this could include training and sending from within China, the entities that are needed to raise up and train and send the missionaries that'll be going out. It could also include partnerships overseas in the destination countries where these Christians are going, being able to work with international agencies in the countries where the Chinese missionaries are ending up. And so that's seen as a real need in terms of partnership in the future. And then the last big need that we see is the area of church planting. Again, we see that the perceived need for help and partnership in church planting is increasing. And when we talk about church planting here, we could talk about two different areas. One would be the urban church in China, where there has really been an explosion of a new kind of urban church as China has moved from being a primarily rural society to being more an urban society. The urban church has just been invented, in a sense, in the last decade. And Christians in China are still feeling their way forward in terms of how to do church planting in the complex urban context of China today. And so they welcome assistance and partnering in that area. But then the second area in terms of church planting would be going overseas, doing mission and going into a new cultural context and planting a church there. And again, the church in China, by and large, doesn't have a lot of experience in that area. And so would welcome partnership in understanding how do we plant churches cross-culturally. I'd like to shift now to look at how does the Chinese government perceive foreign Christians partnering with Christians in China. And I'm going to use the overseas NGO law, which was passed last year, came into effect this year, as an example of how the Chinese government views overseas involvement in China. And before we jump into the details of the overseas NGO law, I think it's important to recognize that the overseas NGO law that we'll be looking at here today is really just one example of an overall context in China of increased tightening and a paranoia on the part of the Chinese government towards foreign organizations. And so domestically, the Chinese government over the last few years has gotten more concerned about controlling what happens in the country, controlling particularly anything that could cause social instability. And they've also increasingly been looking at foreign governments and foreign organizations as a threat. And so wanting to mitigate that threat in the interest of national security. The overseas NGO law that is now in effect comes out of that overall context that we see in China today. And so a few points about this overseas NGO law. First of all, it applies to all NGOs, whether inside or outside China. And I've heard people from different organizations say, well, our ministry doesn't actually have people living in China. We just go in and out and do a few projects. So this new law doesn't really apply to us, does it? Well, in fact, it does. It applies to all nonprofit organizations, wherever they are. As long as they're doing something in China, the new NGO law applies to them. And there are literally thousands of foreign NGOs that are doing various things in China, including many Christian organizations that we could point to. And so far this year, only a couple hundred of them have actually gone through the registration process to become legal entities in China, which means the vast majority today technically are operating outside of this law. The new NGO law introduces a couple hurdles for foreign organizations that are working in China. First of all, they need to find a government-approved partner entity called a professional supervisory unit to vouch for their work and to oversee their work in China. And so this could be a different government organization related to the work that they're doing, whether it's development or social service or education. They need to find the appropriate government entity that relates to their particular sphere, and they need to get that government entity to approve, to agree to be their supervisory unit in China. So that's one hurdle that they need to go through. The second hurdle is to be approved by the Ministry of Public Security. Now, the new NGO law puts the NGOs in China, the foreign NGOs in China, under the supervision of the Ministry of Public Security, not under the Ministry of Civil Affairs, where they had been before and where you would kind of expect them to fall. The fact that the NGOs are now being put under the Ministry of Public Security just emphasizes the whole tenor of this law, which is seeing NGOs not as a helpful thing for society necessarily, but more as a foreign intrusion into China that needs to be controlled. So if we want to control them, we'll put them under the police. And that's exactly what's happened with this law. And so foreign NGOs have to ultimately get the approval of the Ministry of Public Security in order to function in China. The NGO law forbids unauthorized funding, recruiting, or contracting with locals. And so if you're an organization that's been sending money to support some sort of ministry activity in China, or recruiting members for your group in China, and you're not legally registered, technically what you're doing is illegal. And you could face consequences for that. And more importantly, the believers that you're working with in country could face undesirable consequences as a result of the relationship that you have with them. The NGO law also forbids profit-making activities. Traditionally, foreign organizations have gone into China and created business platforms as a way of doing their work in China, because there was no clear way in the past to really register as an NGO in China. And so we have a lot of different business platforms, educational companies, consulting companies, coffee shops that have been set up by basically foreign Christian organizations as a way to carry out their work in China. Under the new NGO law, that kind of activity is not allowed. NGOs are not allowed to do business in China. The new NGO law specifically lays out the areas in which NGOs can work in China. And there's a list of different activities that are allowed under the new NGO law. But it specifically forbids unauthorized religious activities. And so this would include proselytizing in China. It would also include doing training or other things to help the church in China. A legally registered NGO in China is not allowed to do those things. And this new NGO law went into effect on January 1, 2017. So it's now in effect. The registration process is in place. As I mentioned, a couple hundred of NGOs, including about a dozen overtly Christian NGOs, have managed to go through the registration process and have legal status in China. The vast majority are taking a wait-and-see attitude and have not moved ahead with the registration process. So far as we know, nobody has gotten kicked out of China because of the new NGO law and because of their activities not being allowed in China. That's not to say that it won't happen in the future. And so any foreign organization that is doing activity in China, whether you have people resident in the country or you're going in and out doing activities in China, needs to think through carefully this new NGO law, the implications for what they're doing, and whether or not they ought to pursue registration or whether they ought to maybe do their work in a way that would not be an NGO work. For example, doing their work as a commercial activity in China, but not trying to function as an NGO. ChinaSource is working with several organizations in the process of figuring out how the new NGO law applies to them. And if your organization is concerned about this and wanting to know more about how to make sure you don't run afoul of this new NGO law, ChinaSource would be happy to talk with you about that. At the end of this webinar, there's going to be a survey, and there is a prize for somebody who takes that survey, and that's an online course that ChinaSource offers, which covers a lot of the material in this webinar, but in greater depth. It's called Serving Well in China. And along with that online course, we'll also be offering a book by Joanne Pittman about language learning in China. So you'll want to hang around after the webinar and be sure and take the survey and be eligible to maybe win the prize.
Well, thank you, Brent and Joanne. And we do have a few questions that have come in. Just to everybody listening, we're going to have some open Q&A now, and there is a button if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, and you can type your question in there. Joanne, I think you already might have typed an answer back to the person who answered this, but I think everybody will be interested. Somebody asked about the cultural rules that you shared at the beginning. Do they apply to non-Han Chinese tribal groups, Chinese Muslims, or others?
My response to that would be, first of all, I don't have a lot of personal experience in those areas, but my guess is that these rules would broadly be similar in those areas as well. In fact, I think you could make a case that all across Asia, South Asia, Middle East, and maybe even into Africa, but certainly all of Asia would at some level have these cultural values or cultural worldviews, things like faith and relationship and hierarchy and outsider. How they play out in specific subcultures or specific minority cultures might be different. So I would say broadly yes, but the actual playing out of them might look a little bit different.
Yeah, that's helpful. And somebody else asked an interesting question about, should we provide titles for people who are working in China that gives them an opportunity to interact at a higher level of the hierarchy? So how do you sort of handle that, giving titles of... I
think my response would be, it depends on what your organization is doing. Obviously, if you are an organization that's doing stuff on the ground and you're not registered, You don't want to give a local Chinese person a title of, here's my title is, partner strategist or whatever. To what? Because you can't show that title or give that title. Introduce yourself as I'm this title of this organization if the organization doesn't legally exist in China. So that's the first question. If you're registered in China, then yes, I think coming up with titles that would be appropriate to open doors and give the status necessary is important. And it depends on what you're doing. If it's mostly in the religious sphere and you're trying to stay, keep below the radar, then the security risk is higher. But if you're registered, there should be titles. If you're not, no, there shouldn't be.
Okay, that's helpful. One more question for Joanne. And Brent, I'm going to invite you to stop the share screen just so all of our faces are a little bigger for people who are watching. Joanne, I'm curious about, I think Jim asked this to me in chat. He said, can you become an acceptable outsider without living in China or without speaking Chinese? Because some folks on this call maybe are coming and going into China.
Can you be an acceptable outsider without speaking Chinese? I think
or living in China.
Or living in China. Let me answer the first one, then I'll answer the second one. Can you be an acceptable outsider without speaking Chinese? I think yes. And to me, that's counterintuitive. But I know lots of people who live in China who are accepted and what I would say are acceptable outsiders, but they don't know Chinese. They have a big gap. But I would say that learning Chinese is a huge step in that direction. Can you be an acceptable outsider if you're living outside of China? That's a harder one because are you talking about the context of maybe working with Chinese people who are in another culture, let's say working with Chinese people living in your hometown? I think so. Again, you're trying to interact with them in a way that's familiar to them. But on the other hand, the Chinese are the outsiders. And so I work with Chinese a lot here in the States, and we talk a lot about this. It's okay, well, you're the outsider here now. You're the foreigner. And I actually spend a lot of time trying to help them think about what does it mean for them to live an acceptable way in the United States. But the more you can learn about their culture, their customs, their language, even though you and they are not physically in China, the better.
Brent, I have a bunch of questions for you. Several people really appreciated the survey information that you went through there. Curious, because the context of our talk today is around collaborative partnerships between organizations, have you seen some partnerships where, like you said, maybe training is less of a felt need, and so it's more about mentoring, it's more about things like urban church growth? Have you seen some partnerships in those areas? What does that look like?
I certainly have. I can think of one organization that has done training for a long time in China. And over time, they recognized that they needed to go deeper with some of the folks that they're working with. And so part of the work now just involves one American person going over who speaks fluent Chinese and taking pastors on a wilderness retreat for 5 days and helping them to process the leadership issues that they're dealing with and the relational issues that they're dealing with. And so that has become a very fruitful partnership because then those pastors are able to take that and share that with the people that they lead.
Interesting. What about, we've heard some about, and you mentioned it, missionaries coming out of China, so Chinese crossing cultures. What would you suggest are some of the major needs or any examples of ways that Westerners have been able to help our Chinese brothers and sisters?
Because most Han Chinese believers don't have cross-cultural experience, I think one of the best things that can be done is simply to take them on a journey, so to speak. Go with them into a new culture, help them to understand what it means to adjust, to learn the language, to be culturally appropriate, so that eventually they will be able to do the same for other believers in China.
Yeah.
Somebody has to start.
Yeah, that's very practical. This question could be for either one of you, but I'm curious if you've seen a partnership maybe between, a Western church and a Chinese organization or between maybe two missionary organizations where there was a loss of face, and I'm curious about how that was rebuilt.
Joanne, any examples of that you can think of?
I'm not coming up with anything.
And I guess what I'm after is just the principles of, if an outsider who's trying to be acceptable makes a mistake, how do you go ahead and rebuild some of that face? Because you're aware that, somebody's lost face, but how do you initiate that repair?
That's a hard one, because part of the Chinese culture is that you can't deal with things directly. So sometimes the repair and the reconciliation has to come through a third party. So, foreigner A has offended Chinese person B. The foreigner A's culture says go to them directly, but that would be a loss of face. So the Chinese culture says foreigner A should go to Chinese person C, and C and B work it out, and then you never bring it up again.
Well, that's really hard. Yeah, really hard, but it sounds like important to keep your eyes peeled for a mediator or a mutual friend.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
A lot of times it will be done through a third party.
We had one more question just come in from David, who asked, how would you suggest, if you are fluent in Chinese, as some people on this call are, and you have some experience in mentoring, how would you suggest moving forward to explore an opportunity to develop mentoring relationships?
Well, as Joanne has pointed out so well, the relationships are the key, and they take time. And so really, I think the most valuable mentoring relationships are relationships where people have been able to form a friendship. But there's also an identifiable area that needs to be addressed, whether it's a particular ministry niche, a particular relational skill, a particular obstacle or problem that's being faced. That needs to be out there and identified as something that needs to be worked on, and there needs to be agreement that, yes, we're going to work together on that. And then really helping the Chinese partner to identify where they want to go with it, and then being there as a sounding board and encouragement to them.
No, that's incredibly practical, right? It's not just mentoring for the sake of mentoring. It's helping identify what's that need, and do you have that expertise? And I'm sure in all this, folks who are listening, as we get ready to close, the China Source will be more than glad to connect you to folks that have already tried some of these things or are doing some of these things. I'm so grateful to Brent and Joanne for joining us today. A lot of interesting information. Before we sign off, everybody, you'll receive the PowerPoint presentation. You'll be able to access a recording of this webinar within about a week. You will, in the next hour, receive a survey. And if you respond to that survey, because we want to learn how we should improve, there's 2 prizes that'll be given away. Again, a copy of Joanne's book, which is Survival Chinese Lessons, as well as a course that China Source offers to help you dive into some of these concepts deeper. We will have another webinar like this in January, so stay tuned for that. We have recordings on Synergy Commons of the 6 webinars we had this year on a variety of topics. And with that, I just want to thank you. Again, 17 folks from all around the world focusing on how can we partner better in China. And so we're grateful for each of you attending today. May you have a blessed Advent wherever you are, and we will talk to you later.